Hello, I'm Dr. Ron Traylor. This is History 321, and this is video lecture number 18. Now, at the end of video 17, we had just elected Jimmy Davis to his second term as governor of the state of Louisiana. So let's talk in more detail about the direction that um, administration took. Remember, he is elected to serve from 1960 through 1964. His second term of office is remembered chiefly for his failed attempts to maintain segregation in the Orleans parish school system. He had won office on a segregationist platform, and so he was obligated to keep the black children out of Louisiana schools. Now, the problem is that he is faced with a power that's larger than himself. Because the Orleans Parish School Board had been ordered by a federal judge whose name was Scalia, Skelly, Scalia Wright. Federal Judge Scalia Wright had ordered the Orleans Parish School Board to submit a desegregation plan by May of 1960 that would give the details of how Orleans Parish schools would transition from a segregated system where whites and blacks were separated to an integrated system where black and white children went to school together. Now, the school board resisted obeying Judge Wright's order. As a matter of fact, what they did, they took a poll of the parents. And the question that they asked was, should the school stay open if they are integrated? Well, white parents said, oh, yeah, we want to, if it means closing the schools to prevent our children from going to school with black children, close the schools. And the number was 82% to 18%. An overwhelming majority of white parents would have preferred to close the school in order to prevent their children from going to school with black children. The black parents felt the exact opposite. In fact, they felt stronger. The black parents wanted the schools to stay open, integrated, and the numbers there were 95% to 5%. So you have clear-cut differences between the attitudes of white parents and black parents in Orleans Parish. And as a result, the school board ignored the wishes of the black parents and told Judge Wright that they would not submit to his desegregation plan. Wow, spitting in the face of a federal judge, that can't be good. Judge Wright then drew up his own plan requiring desegregation by September of 1960. In other words, he said, look, if you can't do this painlessly, we'll make it painful for you. I'll draw it up, and you'll be forced to obey my ruling. The school board of Orleans Parish at that point pretty much abandoned its responsibility and took the easy way out. They asked the Louisiana State Legislature to give control of Orleans Parish School Board to Governor Davis. And the legislature did that. Governor Davis then ordered the Orleans Parish School Board to remain open, but remain open on a segregated basis, not letting the black children go to school with the white. Judge Wright, of course, knew what was going on, and he declared that Governor Davis's actions were unconstitutional, and again ordered the schools to open on a desegregated basis. Well, faced with the power of the United States government, the Orleans Parish School Board yielded to the court and to Judge Wright, and they promised desegregated schools by November of 1960. But it was their brand of desegregation, not Judge Wright's brand. What the Orleans Parish School Board suggested was that only the first grade classes in only 2 of the public schools be totally integrated. Well, white parents began to withdraw their children from those 2 schools, and within a week, only 2 white children remained at one school and none remained at the other. Davis continues his attempt to do an end run around the federal courts. Davis called the legislature into special session and passed numerous anti-desegregation laws in an unsuccessful attempt to maintain segregation. Now, we talked about how Delesseps Morrison had been Davis's big opponent in the 1960 election. But what I don't think I mentioned was the job. What was the job that Delesseps Morrison had before he ran for the governorship? And that is, he was the mayor of New Orleans. And he continued to be the mayor of New Orleans during this time. And sadly, Morrison, who had seemed to be rather moderate, Morrison did very little to ease this situation. Fortunately for Morrison, he was sort of taken out of the picture because in July of 1961, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy appointed Delesseps Morrison an ambassador to an organization called the Organization of American States. And a new mayor entered office in New Orleans. His name was Victor Schiro. Schiro. Victor Schiro was the new mayor. And he was very happy to go along with Judge Wright's plan. Schiro implemented a policy of peaceful compliance with the federal program. In November of 1961, 6 more schools were desegregated in Orleans Parish. And in a few more years, the entire system was totally integrated. Now, most of Davis's term was wasted in this unsuccessful attempt to stop desegregation that put the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana under a national media microscope. In addition to his absolute opposition to the racial desegregation of Louisiana schools, Davis began a program of bridge building that increased the state debt, which included the Sunshine Bridge at Donaldsonville. Now, I remember this very well. I was in high school, but I remember this like it was yesterday. Uh, there was a negative term that was applied to the Sunshine Bridge at the time. It was called the Bridge to Nowhere because there were no roads leading to the Sunshine Bridge and there were no roads leading off the Sunshine Bridge. There was just this bridge sitting out there in the middle of the cane fields that didn't have an end on either end. Now, of course, that's been changed over the years. He built a new governor's mansion. It had 18 bedrooms. And of course, he built it at public expense. Now, there were some good things. There always are good things. There were some good things that Davis accomplishes. He was responsible for creating a code of ethics for state employees, a list of do's and don'ts, the things that state employees and do, and the things they can't do, the things that will get them in trouble if they do them. He created the first college student loan bill in the country. He passed a law that required if there were any idle state funds sitting in the Treasury, that those funds had to be invested, and any interest that money earned then would go back into the state treasury. And this worked. It added literally millions of dollars to the Louisiana state treasury every year, every single solitary year. Okay. The election of 1964. We're moving right along here, folks. Among the candidates in the gubernatorial election of 1964 is our old friend De Lesseps Morrison, the former mayor of New Orleans and former ambassador to the Organization of American States. He's making another run at the governorship. And he ran on his experience in both federal and in city government. And he certainly did have experience. Former Governor Robert Kinney also ran as an anti-John Kennedy Democrat. By the way, that tactic proved to be very disastrous for Bob Kennan because while the election is going on, JFK was assassinated, and many people in Louisiana and in the country began to view Kennedy as a martyr. Another of the candidates was a man by the name of John McKitheon, M.C. Keithen. John McKitheon was a public service commissioner from Columbia. He had served in the state legislature. As a matter of fact, he had served as a floor leader for Governor Earl Long in the legislature. He was very popular in North Louisiana, and he hoped that popularity in North Louisiana would result in a second place finish in the first primary, and then he could go ahead and win in the second primary. So his goal was at least surviving the first primary. And as a result of that first primary, Morrison had a huge lead over McKitheon. But McKitheon, just like Jimmy Davis had done against De Lesseps Morrison, McKitheon played the race card. He accused Morrison of being soft on race. Not only did he accuse him of being soft on race, but he accused him of collusion with the NAACP in order to get the black vote. Down and dirty politics, right? Morrison refused to debate the race issue, preferring to concentrate on industrial development, economic development. And McKitheon won the runoff by a pretty small margin. Now, before this election, this is the election of 1964. Before this election, Louisiana had always been a two-party state, but it was always the Democrats who won. I mean, on paper, let me sort of change that statement. On paper, Louisiana was a two-party state, Democrats, Republicans. But the reality is that the Republicans couldn't win at anything on a statewide basis. Now, and that is true until 1964. In 1964, after McKitheon had won the Democratic runoff, had beaten Morrison, which in the past would have also been the same thing as winning the governorship. That changes in 1964 because the first serious Republican challenger in the 20th century runs for the governorship. His name was Charlie Lyons. Now, Lyons loses to McKitheon. But for the first time in the 20th century, the Republicans make a strong showing in the governor's race. So let's talk about John McKinney. Served from, well, I'm not going to tell you that because things are getting ready to change. McKinney does, in fact, increase taxes in order to fund health issues, education, welfare programs, and public works projects such as bridges and roads and things like that. While McKinney was governor, state spending on education rose 20%. So he was serious, wasn't he? And the state expenses on highway construction, highways and bridges, increased 40%. So McKinney is trying to keep his promises, isn't he? There were also increases, maybe not as large, but nevertheless, there were appreciable increases in old age pensions, uh, funds going to the charity hospitals at that time that are scattered here, there, and yonder around the state, assistance to the disabled, especially the blind. McKinney, although he played the race card on de Lesseps Morrison, McKinney turns out to be one of Louisiana's most socially responsible governors. Um, he did his best to enforce a strict code of ethics for state employees. He created a centralized purchasing system that literally saved the state of Louisiana millions of dollars every year. That law um, that Davis had created that um, reinvested idle state funds. McKinney strengthened that law. What did McKinney do with regard to race relationships in the state of Louisiana once he becomes the governor? Well, the answer might be surprising to you. Yes, he had run on an anti-black, pro-segregation platform. He had played the race card, accused Morrison of being soft on race. But the reality was that once McKinney becomes governor, he accepts the inevitability of integration. He can sort of read the tea leaves, and he realizes that it's going to happen whether he likes it or not. And as a result, he officially declares, hey, come on, guys, the races are going to have to learn how to live together. Now, does that mean that people all over Louisiana, including John McKinney, had a group hug with their black brothers? Of course not. Racism was still very common. But it's the beginning of the end. It's not the end of the end, it's the beginning of the end uh, for segregation in Louisiana. Uh, One thing that McKinney does, he creates, and this works very well, by the way, he creates a biracial commission to study race related issues. And this blew the mind of many Louisianians. In 1964, under the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, because Kennedy had been assassinated in 63. In 1964, the Congress creates the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that changes everything. And guess what? John McKinney supports it. He assisted federal registrars in enforcing the rights of blacks to vote. He appoints some, not a lot, but some, it's an improvement. He appoints some blacks to important positions in his administration. And as a result, by 1971, More than 200,000 black and white school children attended integrated schools in Louisiana. And most of those schools had integrated peacefully. With regard to industry in Louisiana, remember Louisiana had historically been an agricultural state and remained so well into the 20th century, despite the oil and the gas and the sulfur and all that stuff that we talked about in an earlier lecture. We still were dominantly an agricultural state. McKinney brought more than $2 billion in industrial capital investment into the state of Louisiana. And those facilities, those plants, those factories created I'm getting ready to misspeak. Created 50,000 really well-paying industrial jobs. Something that Louisiana had never really enjoyed before. In 1967, while John McKinney was the governor of Louisiana, the legislature passed a new law that would permit 2 consecutive terms for Louisiana governors. And as a result of that, McKinney ran for a second term in 1968, and he won. And it's not surprising that he won, but how he won was surprising. He had no real serious opposition. McKinney was accused by Life magazine, and I don't even think Life magazine exists anymore. But nevertheless, at that time, it was one of the most important news magazines in the country. McKinney was accused by Life magazine of protecting organized crime in Louisiana. The article said that Carlos Marcello, some people pronounce it Marcello, had made several questionable deals with McKinney. Now, Carlos Marcello was the godfather of organized crime in the state of Louisiana at this time. However, a state investigative committee found no evidence of wrongdoing. There were never any indictments. As a matter of fact, probably the most controversial action of McKinney's administration, which was, as it turned out, was an 8-year administration, right? The most controversial of his actions probably was the authorization of construction of the Louisiana Superdome. Now, I remember this as well. There was great opposition to building the Louisiana Superdome. People said that it was going to be the greatest disaster in the history of Louisiana. McKinney and a developer by the name of Dave Dixon stuck to their guns. And now I have no idea how much revenue the Louisiana Superdome brings in for the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana, but it is a bunch. All right. So McKinney could not run for a third term, right? He could run for a second, and he did, and he was successful. He could not run for a third term. So in 1972, he is out. By this time, Louisiana voting patterns were beginning to change. The long anti-long fight that had been so important for decades was beginning to lose importance. There was a huge increase by 1972 of black voting registration. And in addition to people like Earl Long, who had encouraged black voting registration, now it was a mandate from the United States government. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 changed the entire complexion of voting in the United States, not the least in the South, and not the least of that in Louisiana. So, black voters were becoming a really important force in Louisiana politics. Additionally, Republicans were becoming, and additionally, were also becoming a force in Louisiana. Remember, we mentioned Charlie Lyons, in the election of 1964, the first Republican to really challenge the Democrats. Well, that continues in the election of 1972. White Republicans were becoming a force in state politics. Now, initially in that election, 17 people ran for the governorship. It was a very confused scenario. Only 8 of them were really serious candidates. But even with 8 candidates, that's still confusing. How do you keep up with 8 serious candidates? Now, initially, Jimmy Davis, he just never gave up, did he? Jimmy Davis announced that he was going to be a candidate again. And one of the Long family, a man by the name of Gillis Long, also announced that he was going to make a run for the governorship. And at least at the beginning, Jimmy Davis and Gillis, Gillis, Gillis Long were the front runners at the very beginning. Davis discovered, surprise, surprise, Davis discovered that he was very unpopular with black voters due to his treatment of black parents, and black school children in New Orleans with the Orleans Parish School Board. That fiasco. Long wanted the votes of the remaining Long men and black voters, but he was not an exciting candidate. Okay, nobody could get excited over Gillis Long. The only thing that was exciting about Gillis Long was his last name. He was a Long. There was another Long in that race. His name was Speedy. Speedy, isn't that a great name? Speedy Long, who was, like Gillis, was a distant cousin of Huey and Earl, went after the same votes as Gillis, which was the black voters and the Long faction. Sam Bell was also a serious candidate. And what makes Sam Bell unique is that he was the first serious black gubernatorial candidate since Reconstruction. And it was almost a guarantee that Sam Bell would get a lot of the black votes because he himself was black, which meant he was going to take black votes away from the people who needed them, such as Gillis and Speedy Long. Another of the serious candidates was a man by the name of Teddy Aycock, Aycock. He went by the initial CC, but nobody called him that. Called him Teddy. Teddy Aycock had served as the lieutenant governor under both Jimmy Davis and John McKinney. So Teddy Aycock had legitimate government experience. Another of the serious candidates was a man from Crowley by the name of Edwin Edwards. Edwin Edwards. At the time, he was a member of the United States House of Representatives from Louisiana, from over near Crowley. Another of the serious candidates was a state senator from Shreveport whose name was Bennett Johnson. Bennett Johnson. Johnston, I'm sorry. Johnston. Bennett Johnson was from Shreveport, and he was probably, of all the men in the race, a true reformer. And the last of these 8 serious candidates was a very wealthy grocery store chain owner by the name of John Schwegman. Let me spell that one for you. Schwegman. He was a New Orleans grocer. He was a consumer advocate. Now, in the first primary, Edwards came in first, and Johnston came in second. So, uh, no one won that first primary outright. It was a plurality. Edwards had the plurality, right? The most votes, but not a majority of the votes. Both candidates openly appealed to black voters for their support in the election of 1972. And that was a huge change in Louisiana politics. And it had to be. Black voters in Louisiana could no longer be ignored because they were a major factor in Louisiana politics. Now, remember, there are almost as many black voters in Louisiana by 1972 as there are white voters. You couldn't just brush them off. Plus, they had registered to vote in great numbers. First, under Earl Long, and then under the rules that were created by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, so Edwards and Bennett Johnston go into the runoff, and it was an extraordinarily tight race. More than 1 million votes were cast, and Edwards won by about 5,400 votes. That's it. Now, as I said earlier, Republicans were becoming more powerful in the state of Louisiana, more influential. And so the fact that Edwin Edwards had won the Democratic nomination for the governor did not guarantee anymore that he would actually become the next governor. Edwards runs against the Republican David Treen, Treen, in the general election. And Treen, now let me spoil the story and tell you that the Republican Treen loses, right? Edwin Edwards becomes the governor of Louisiana, but Treen gets 43% of the total votes cast. And what that tells us is that there was a really growing strength of the Republican Party among whites and blacks in Louisiana. All right, so let's talk about the first term of Edwin Edwards. One of the main accomplishments of his first term, the first 4 years, was that the Louisiana Constitution was rewritten in 1974. It replaced the Constitution of 1924, which we have not talked about yet, but we will, I promise you. The Constitution of 74 replaced the Constitution of 24, which had been, you do the math, had been in place for 50 years. And by this time, the Constitution of 1924 had been amended so many times that even constitutional scholars couldn't tell you what the Constitution of 1924 really meant and what it really said. Included in the Constitution of 1974 was a very strong Bill of Rights that prohibited racial and gender discrimination. The Louisiana Constitution of 1974 was way ahead of its time, especially in the South. The Superdome in New Orleans was constructed during Edwards's first term, although it cost a lot more money to build than had originally been predicted. It had been predicted that it would cost $35 million. And by the time the first fans walked in, the cost had risen to $400 million. Right? Yeah. What, 12, 13 times more expensive than they had originally thought? Oh, by the way, this won't be on an exam or a quiz. I was in the first tour group ever to tour the Superdome. It was still under construction. They had not put down the turf yet. As a matter of fact, that big scoreboard that is over the 50-yard line, it was laying on the 50-yard line. It had not been hoisted into place yet. And we just all, I was a student here at Southeastern. I was a member of a business fraternity called Delta Sigma Pi. And we were invited to tour, and we all just walked around with our mouths open. It was just the most amazing thing that we had ever seen. Because I had not yet been to the Astrodome in Houston. And so this was the first dome stadium that I'd ever seen. And I was absolutely floored. Okay, that won't be on the quiz. Under Edwin Edwards, the oil and natural gas severance tax was raised. Now, that's a very complicated thing. Let's try to simplify it. The state of Louisiana got money every time a barrel of oil or a cubic foot of natural gas was pumped out of the ground. And that tax, that amount was raised during Edwards's administration. And it came at a time when oil and gas prices were skyrocketing. And as a result, the state got rich. The state had more money than it knew what to do with. Under Edwards, the state of Louisiana also doubled the corporate income tax rates. So we've got two streams of revenue coming in that are very good for the state of Louisiana, the severance tax and corporate income tax. Now, sadly, state spending also skyrocketed during this time. And in the short term, it was a very good thing, but not necessarily good in the long term. For example, it can't be bad that more money is being spent for education, more money is being spent for state parks, more money is being spent for state employee salaries, more money is being spent for hospital funds and welfare funds, and the list just keeps going over and over and on and on. But nevertheless, in spite of the increased spending, Louisiana remained at or near the bottom in things like teachers' salaries and illiteracy rates and poverty rates. Now, in the election of 1976, remember, the governors can now serve 2 consecutive terms. Edwin Edwards runs for re-election in 1976, and he is, in fact, elected. He easily won re-election. He got 63% of the vote. Folks, that's unheard of. To get almost 2/3 of all the votes that are cast. So, what of Edwin Edwards's second term? He helped create a stronger code of ethics. He put strict budget controls into spending for highways. In other words, we're going to keep building highways, but we're going to be very careful. We're going to take good control of the money that we spent. Of course, there were scandals. And if you're from Louisiana, and if you've been here for any time at all, the name Edwin Edwards and the word scandal, we know, go hand in hand. Edwards was accused, once again, itchy nose. He was accused while he was a U.S. congressman, before he ever became governor. He was accused of permitting a Korean businessman to give a $10,000 cash gift to his wife, Mrs. Edwards, which was absolutely against every code of ethics. His commissioner of administration, in other words, the guy who was Edwards's right-hand man, is a man by the name of Charles Romer, Roemer. Charles Romer would serve jail time for corruption in office. One of Edwards's main allies in the state legislature was a state senator by the name of Michael O'Keefe, O Keefe, O'Keefe. He was the most powerful man in the Senate. He also went to jail on corruption charges. Now, what was the question that was being asked in Louisiana? It was a rather simple question. If Edwards is commissioner of administration is a crook, and his close personal friend and political ally Michael O'Keefe is a crook, then what does that say about Edwards? Isn't he probably a crook himself? Well, nobody could find anything on Edwards. They made accusations, but nothing could be proven. And Edwards began to be known as the Teflon governor. All right, the idea that nothing would stick. None of these accusations would stick to Governor Edwards, like burning eggs wouldn't stick in a pan, right? If it was a Teflon coated plan. Now, also during the same time, blacks began to become a significant force in state politics. By the time that Edwards is elected to the second term in 1976, blacks represented 1/4 of the state's registered voters. Many of Louisiana's black citizens no longer live out in the country. Many of Louisiana's black citizens lived in urban areas, in cities and towns. They lived in New Orleans and Baton Rouge and Opelousas and Natchitoches and Alexandria and Shreveport and Monroe. And black voters voted. They didn't just register and then never show up again. They registered and then they actually voted. And white politicians understood that. And they understood that blacks represented a powerful voting bloc to which white candidates had to appeal if the candidate wanted to be successful. As a matter of fact, Edwards later acknowledged that black support won him the 1972 election. Remember how close that was? Fewer than 6,000 votes? Now, the election of 1980 rolls around. Now, remember that for years and years and years, Republicans were a non-issue in Louisiana politics. Victory by a Democratic candidate in the Democratic primary just automatically meant that you were going to be the winner. And change in Louisiana came very slowly. President Eisenhower, he took Louisiana in 1956 in his presidential campaign. And Barry Goldwater took the state of Louisiana in the 1964 campaign. That name Charlton Lyons in mind. That was also 1964, wasn't it? The first serious challenger by a Republican candidate in the 20th century. And the Lyons didn't win. But it was a serious run. It was a run that nobody could ignore anymore. Dramatic change began to happen in Louisiana. And quite often the change was caused by racial attitudes. Now, this is something that's very uncomfortable to talk about, but it's something that we cannot ignore. Louisianians had white, let's be specific here, white Louisianians had historically voted Democratic. They had voted Democratic before the Civil War, and they went back to voting Democratic after Reconstruction was over. And they had voted Democratic historically since then. But by the 1960s, the National Democratic Party was beginning to make a turn away from the old racist attitudes of the southern wing of the Democratic Party. And many southern white Democrats resented the fact that Lyndon Johnson, who himself was a southern Democrat, had led the charge on creating the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So there was a dissatisfaction across the South and in Louisiana over the increasingly important role of blacks in state politics. And the result of that is that Democrats began as a trickle, began to abandon the Democratic Party in the South, in Louisiana, and began to embrace the Republicans. Not that the Republicans were not racists, but because the Democrats were actively anti-racists. The Louisiana Republican Party did not really make racist appeals. The Republicans did not have to come out and say, vote for me because I oppose desegregation. They didn't have to say that. But its conservative policies, nevertheless, drew the attention of many white Southerners, and many of those white Southerners became former Democratic white. During this tape, remember our discussion of Dave Treen, who had been one of those 8 candidates for the governorship? Dave Treen, who was from Metairie, became the first Republican United States congressman elected from Louisiana in the 20th century. In 1974, a man by the name of Henson Moore, Henson, Henson Moore was elected to Congress, and in 1977, Robert Livingston also won a congressional seat. More and more Louisiana Democrats begin to abandon the Democratic Party. In 1980, Ronald Reagan took the state, and then he did it again in 1984. In 1980, Dave Treen was the only Republican in the race. He ran against a large number of Democrats who included Public Service Commissioner Lewis Lambert, James Fitzmaurice, Fitzmorris, who was the incumbent Louisiana governor, lieutenant governor, and State Senator Edgar Mouton. That's a good Cajun name, right? In that governor's race, Treen finished first, and Lambert finished second. Now, by that time, Louisiana had something that was called an open primary. In the past, there had been a Democratic primary, only Democrats could participate, and there had been a Republican primary in which only Republicans participated. But by the election of 1980, that had been done away with, and Democrats and Republicans competed in the same primary. So, in this case, in the election of 1980, Treen, the Republican, finishes first, and Lambert, the Democrat, finishes second. Now, it gets even more weird. It gets weirder and weirder. Treen, the Republican, was endorsed by several of the losing Democratic candidates. And out of a total of 1.1 million votes, he wins the election by about 9,000 votes. So, David Treen becomes Louisiana's first Republican governor since Reconstruction. Now, in many ways, Dave Treen was a disappointment to other conservative Republicans. because he continued the heavy spending of former Governor Edwin Edwards. He failed in his attempt to get a to earn $500 million for the state by further taxing oil and gas in Louisiana. And as a result, he increased the state's debt. And he supported something that many of you, if you have heard of it, you've forgotten. Most of you have never heard of it. There was a World's Fair in New Orleans in 1984. The big name of it, the formal name of it was the Louisiana World Exposition, but it was called the World's Fair. Right there on the river, upriver a little bit from Jackson Square, where the old Jackson Brewery was. Right today, there are a bunch of very elegant boutique shops and things there now. Well, those shops are there because they took over the space after the World's Fair left. They took over the space that had been created by and for the World's Fair. The problem with the World's Fair was that it lost $140 million. It never paid for itself. It didn't even come close. And much of that had been guaranteed, much of that $140 million had been guaranteed by the state government and by the city of New Orleans. And so both the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans lose money. And Dave Treen had been a strong supporter of the World's Fair. And so it damaged him politically, whether it was right or whether it was wrong to do that. In 1984, the next gubernatorial election rolls around. Treen, the Republican governor, the incumbent governor, is running for re-election. And former Governor Edwin Edwards, the Democrat, announces that he'll seek a third term, which is just perfectly legal. That you can't serve 3 consecutive terms, but you can serve 2, which was the case of Edwards, lay out for 4 years, and then be elected again. That was perfectly okay. And that's what the plan was. He was going to try to be elected for a third term. And he had a lot of advantages. Edwin Edwards had a lot of advantages. Proven ability. He had been the governor 8 years previous to this. He'd also been a United States congressman from Louisiana. He had a colorful personality. Louisianians loved that. He had strong backing from black Louisianians and organized labor in Louisiana. And Treen, the incumbent, was at a real disadvantage because in 4 years he had created large budget deficits. There was growing unemployment in the state. And there was just generally a lack of public confidence in Dave Treen and in his ability to govern the state of Louisiana. And the results showed that. Edwards won a landslide and becomes the first person to be elected to 3 terms. They were not consecutive terms, but nevertheless, 3 terms in Louisiana's history. Now, let's wrap this lecture up with a discussion of Edwards's third term. We've got 6.5 minutes or so. Okay, I can do that. Edwin Edwards became the governor just in time. It became governor in 1984, just in time to oversee one of the most serious economic crises in the state's history. Because one of Louisiana's most profitable resources was oil and gas. And the state had made bucket loads of money off oil and gas down through the years, the decades. But in 1984, by 1984, there was a surplus, a worldwide surplus of oil, especially. And the price of oil went down the toilet. And it didn't matter how much oil Louisiana pumped out of the ground, they just weren't getting enough of it per barrel to make it profitable for the oil companies to continue to drill. So many of the oil wells in Louisiana were shut down. And the Louisiana is not making anything from the taxes on that oil and the natural gas. And that deprives the state of Louisiana of its principal source of income. To balance the budget required huge tax increases, more than $1 billion. And these were tax increases that were alien to Louisianians. Remember, we had never been asked to pay for the cost of government because we always had the oil industry and the gas industry and big business to pick up the slack. Not so anymore. Even though taxes were increased by more than $1 billion, Edwards was still unable to balance the budget. And so for the next 3 years, as the nation began to enjoy prosperity, Louisiana suffered from an economic depression. We had put all of our eggs in the energy basket, and to mix some metaphors, the chickens were coming home to roost. Thousands of oil workers lost their jobs. Louisiana had the highest unemployment rate in the nation for the last 6 years of the 1980s. Between 1983 and 1989, we lost 170,000 jobs. And people left the state by the thousands looking for employment somewhere else. And the state had a population loss in the 1980s. Now, those of you who know anything about the Constitution know that how many members of the U.S. House of Representatives that a state has is determined by that state's population. The bigger your population, the more representatives you have. The less your population, the fewer you have. Louisiana lost a U.S. congressman in the 80s because of this flight from Louisiana by so many of our people. Now, Edwards tried to respond. He slashed spending, finally, but it was still too late. It was too late to balance the budget. He suggested that the way to make up that deficit, and this would lead to his downfall, he suggested that casino gambling and a state lottery would be the way to solve the financial problems. But, at least initially, that plan failed to receive approval. There were scandals attached to Edwards' third term. He and some of his friends were indicted for receiving preferential treatment in awarding hospital and nursing home contracts. This was the most serious political scandal in the state of Louisiana since the 1930s with Richard Lesh. And remember what Lesh, he wound up in a federal penitentiary. Now, Edwards and his friends were acquitted, but it left that image of a wheeler dealer behind. And that's a good place to stop. And I will see you soon for the next video lecture.